been very busy on several fronts, so glad that she can take the time to join us today and join in the discussion. Today we're going to be talking about the value-based modifier, and there are a lot of technical issues that need to be addressed over the next several months. We want to make sure we're on the same page about what the questions are, so we can drive our work planning to provide answers in future meetings. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, so we can make sure we've got the right questions, and then we can drive the work planning going forward. But first, let's go around the room and do brief introductions. We can see if there's anybody who's on the work group who's on the phone. Going one.
Yeah. Yeah, this is Stan Dorn.
And?
From the Urban Institute.
All right.
Donna Kenzer, HSCRC.
Kennedy Strotman, standing in for Linda Baditska.
Bruce Ritchie, Peninsula Regional.
Mike Robbins, Maryland Hospital Association.
I'm Joe Ross. I'm from Meritus Health in Hagerstown, Maryland.
Colleen Cherubini, Maryland Primary Care. MedStar Health.
Steve Evans, MedStar Health.
Mitch Womack, Agnes.
Pat Zapp, Anne Arundel.
Stu Gutterman, formerly of Academy Health.
Adam Kane, representing Heritage.
Laura Mandel, HSCRC, Chris.
All right. Anybody else? Okay. And so our agenda today will be to provide you with some updates on initiatives that we have with CMS, the care redesign program, CCIP and CCIP, an update on the concept paper on the value-based modifier, and then we will describe the possible scaling of the VBM. So this is going to be a little bit different from what we had shown last time in terms of how a VBM could be structured, but it's going to be in line with other HSCRC payment adjustments like MHAC. And again, our primary goal for today's meeting is to discuss the policy and technical issues that will need to be addressed for the VBM. And just as a reminder, the current expectation is for the Medicare total cost of care VBM to be in place by January 1st, 2018. And so to get to that point, we would need a final recommendation from HSCRC commissioners by the December 2017 commission meeting, a draft recommendation by the November 2017 commission meeting. And the VBM, just to make clear, it could be modified in future years. So our focus here is on the startup year 1 for 2018. And going forward, things could look different. It could be modified based on phase 2, lessons learned, et cetera. And it could also increase the amount of revenue at risk over time, consistent with other HSCRC policies. So with that as an overview, let me turn it over to Donna to give an update on where we are on the Care Redesign Amendment program.
I just heard phone and I was thinking, no, it's actually a computer. It's all good, all good. Yeah, so we are getting the documents out for the care redesign programs, and we've gotten draft documents, and they're being turned around through the process. We're hopeful of having something that could be ready for public view here very, very shortly. But we have an update to the all-payer agreement in the draft form, as well as the participation agreement, and we're working it through the process. There's a lot of lawyers, so that's about all I would say about that situation. And we're trying to, as I call it, grind it out. And we are in that completion phase with the document. Now we just have to keep the foot on the gas pedal to make sure that they get it back out of the side with otherwise things have a way of just stopping. So we're continuing to try to keep our foot on the gas pedal there. But we do.
Parties to the amendment.
Okay, so the amendment is with the state, and so as before with the agreement, the governor, the Secretary of Health, and the HSCRC will sign the amendment, and then there's a participation agreement, and the participation agreement will be between the CMS, the hospital, and the state. So the participation agreement will now allow you to get the data that you need, and also establish the direct relationship that is required for you to get waivers. Because if they gave the state waivers, it really wouldn't be very helpful, because you all are the ones who actually need the waivers. So it sets into place a process so that you can get waivers and data.
Does it, other than by itself, represent a waiver, or is there anticipated a subsequent round of paperwork waiver stage?
The waivers are coming out at the same time. They're not. The waivers are a separate activity by a separate set of people from those who write the participation agreement and the amendment. There's a separate group over in the federal government that does the waivers.
So we'll have sort of a roadmap in terms of the program.
Right.
The authority to do that through the waiver granted in the participation agreement, and the data to drive that process all wrapped together in that final step?
Yes, because that's the expectation, is that it will all come together in that final step. And then the state, through the amendment, will have the authority to present new programs on templates to the federal government that the stakeholders want to implement. So it's, and not to have to go through an approval process like this again. So that if we have another program, we have two programs that we're looking at right now, but there may be another one that you want. You may want one with nursing homes, or some folks may want to do an episode type of view, getting more, extending the hospital DRG into an episode, or other adjustments can be done through a more simple submission. Now, of course, if there's claims processing changes, that's a whole different issue, but other programs could be approved through a simple process, not going through the entire federal government. So the amendment is set up to be flexible on an ongoing basis, so we don't have a long-term approval process, and that we can control that the submission and approval process locally.
And that subsequent creative programming would be facility or group or community to state to CMS. CMS can approve without the broader agency involvement. Am I understanding you correctly?
The amendment has parameters. It has parameters that you have to meet in order to have a program approvable, but so it doesn't have to go through the entire process. The parameters are defined. So, for example, you have parameters defined in your ACO of things that you're allowed to do. So the amendment provides parameters of things that can be done under the amendment, and those programs can be teed up in a template form similar to the HCIP and CCIP. I think that we will want to have programs that are broadly utilized, and there could be, although there can be, even in the broadly utilized programs, there's flexibility in how you implement those broadly utilized programs. Even with the CCIP and the HCIP, there's already a lot of flexibility in those programs. So that's
the HCIP program templates, are there any significant changes to those, or pretty much what hospitals are reviewing are the templates?
I think there's some changes to the template layout. So we're still making sure that we capture the easiest flow of the template layout to get the templates filled out efficiently.
Are any of the content of the templates changing, or is the content pretty much the same?
I'd have to ask Deb and see whether we think there's any additional changes that are coming.
And then the agreement that hospital signed July 1st, like with the GBR agreement stays put. Does the July 1st agreement go away? Because some of the stuff in the HCIP is very similar. That might just be something to look at. Does the HCIP agreement replace the July 1st agreement that hospital signed, which had requirements in it, which had care redesign and other things in that agreement? There was some overlap.
That we will actually probably have a GBR agreement overlay on top of the HCIP and CCIP that kind of adopts those agreements to apply them on an all-payer basis where applicable. The agreements are written in the voice of Medicare, and so to make them applicable in an all-payer environment, then we'll do an overlay. So it'll be conformity, not as opposed to
another agreement that hospitals have to sign, as well as the CMS agreement.
Yeah, something hopefully fairly simple.
The participation agreement that you reference is between the hospital and the state and CMMI. What about, if I guess you would call them participation agreements between hospitals and any physicians that they want to engage in either of these programs? Is there a separate document for that? And where is that in the drafting stage, if there is?
I mean, I know that there's a separate document for that. I will have to check on the. I don't think it's one that the CMS lawyers are particularly focused on.
Donna, this is Deb. Is Mike asking about the care partner agreement?
Yes.
The care partner agreement, CMS is not interested in it. So that will need to be worked out between the hospitals and the doctors, but we are working on a template for you, Mike, so that you guys have something to start with. As far as the HCIP implementation protocol question that was asked earlier, so far there is not substantive changes in the program. For the HCIP, it's mainly the implementation protocol formatting at this point.
Any other questions on the amendment program before we go on? All right, and I know some folks have come in since we started, so we can go around for the folks and they can say who they are.
This is the late John Colmers.
Calling out the late people here.
And I'm Doug Mitchell. I'm one of the founding members and the CEO of a large hospitalist group in Maryland. We've recently changed our name to Definitive Health. So, but anyways, in about 12 hospitals around Maryland and 45 SNFs.
Good morning. It's Chad Perman from DHMH Population Health.
Hi, Kristen Polio, Adventist Healthcare.
All right. Are there any more people who've joined on the phone from the work group?
Paul Miller.
All right. So now we want to talk and give an update on the VBM concept paper for CMS. We have not as of yet, provided this to CMS. We were shooting for the end of February, but we are still working on it. But just want to update you that our primary purpose is to seek a CMS determination that Maryland hospitals are advanced APM entities and that clinicians participating in care redesign programs, and of course the ones coming out of the gate are HCIP and CCIP, that those clinicians would be eligible to be qualifying APM participants based on the percentage of Medicare beneficiaries or of revenue that is from Maryland residents, and potentially also including PSAs in other states, which is an issue that came up last time. So we're trying to look at that. The emphasis is that we also want to note that Medicare financial responsibility is already borne by Maryland hospitals, not only in terms of the hospital-specific GBR, but also on the statewide total cost of care. That's a concept that was also mentioned by the work group last time. And I want to illustrate how the VBM is designed to further satisfy federal macro requirements by placing hospital revenue at risk, similar to other quality programs based on a hospital-specific measure of Medicare total cost of care. Of course, this is consistent with the progression plan. So as we talked about last time, the proposed macro framework for Maryland starts at the top with you have to have an alternative payment model, an APM. The Maryland All-Payer model meets that by being a model operating under Section 1115A of the Social Security Act. The next step that we are driving toward is to have Maryland hospitals recognized as advanced APM entities based on the criteria we talked about last time. The terminology from the macro regs that we are using and driving toward is affiliated practitioners. So clinicians partnering through HCIP or CCIP would be affiliated practitioners. And then the final test is the threshold, as I mentioned. And so if you have enough of revenue or enough of your beneficiaries who are qualifying under a model, then they would be QPs. And so it's possible that there are clinicians who would sign up to be an HCIP or CCIP but don't meet the threshold, and so they would not be QPs in that scenario. And this is from essentially last time as well, just putting additional detail about what the two thresholds are, how they're changing over time in terms of the patient count or the payment amount threshold, and that our idea is to have the Maryland residents be in the numerator for that, including potentially also, again, the out-of-state PSAs.
So, Chris, this is a question. So from a physician perspective, only the patients in CCIP or is it all Maryland?
It's all your patients. So all of your patients who are Medicare bennies are in the denominator.
Okay.
And then all of those who are Maryland residents or associated with the model through a PSA are in the numerator. And that's one of the goals, was to have this trying to.
So this 20% threshold is, in most cases, will be met.
That's what the hope is. I mean, there could be some physicians. So if, I'm just going to make up a scenario of something that wouldn't meet, so we can say what wouldn't meet. But maybe there's a physician in Virginia who does a little bit of work with a Maryland hospital, but most of their patients are actually down in near Fairfax Hospital, and they happen to work in the HCIP program, and they do a few patients in Maryland. Well, they're not going to get macro qualification by having 10% of their patients
as Maryland
Medicare beneficiaries, because that's really not meeting the intent or the threshold. So we're trying to be as inclusive as possible, and in terms of capability to, include.
If you have 20% or greater of Maryland Medicare beneficiaries, then we hope would meet the threshold.
It goes up. It goes up very quickly. So we have to be really focused on year 2. 50%. We really need to be focused on 50 So that's 20 there, but we need to focus on 50 as a requirement.
Just a quick question. I understand this is on an individual practitioner basis, but can that be also done on a group practice basis? So if you have, in the example you just gave, that one physician is part of a larger group where most of their work is done in Maryland, but that one particular practitioner is primarily based at Fairfax Hospital, is it possible that the group as a whole could qualify even if the individual could?
That would definitely not be the intent that we were pursuing.
Okay. Thank you.
And the federal MACRA regs, in terms of affiliated practitioners, point specifically to it's on an individual clinician level.
Recognizing that you haven't submitted the concept paper yet, I'm sure there's ongoing conversations. What's been CMS's reaction to the proposal that hospitals are AAPM entities?
Well, I think what they have said is, on the one hand, they recognize it in terms of a strict reading of the law, but they have expressed that there needs to be more accountability on the non-hospital side in order for them to go the extra step to actually acknowledge that the care redesign amendment programs are MACRA eligible.
Yes, so they're basically, saying they're expecting the VBM, or they will dig in, and it will take a very long time for us to move through the process to have it reviewed if we don't bring the physicians in a little bit tighter. So I think really they're expecting that the physicians are going to be brought in tighter. We want the physicians to be brought in tighter because that's what we're trying to do, is engage physicians in the care improvement programs, and we have this as part of the phase 2 plan. So it's all part of the plan that's been laid out of how we're going to get physicians more engaged and into MACRA eligible programs, so that we have our ER physicians and our hospitalists all pushing in the same direction to reduce avoidable readmissions and reduce avoidable utilization and take care of the patients better on a person-centered basis and get the episodes working well. And that's what we want the physicians to hear. And so it's really important to get that linkage in place. It's important for the credibility to go in front of the MACRA review team, and it's also important for the credibility of our progression plan to tie, to begin to create voluntary programs that have hospitals and physicians working collaboratively toward the same set of goals.
I hope we could at least raise the issue of group practice versus individual. I understand how legislation was written, but legislation really didn't have state lines in it. And so that really wasn't contemplated in the original MACRA legislation. This would put me in a situation where have roughly 50% of the primary care in the market, but would exclude individual members of that group of employed physicians because of their percentage of Pennsylvania or West Virginia patients, and they're positioned to take care of those people because they work in our statistical metropolitan service area. They're coming in daily.
We have defined in the amendment, and we have to get approved, but in our amendment definition of Maryland Medicare beneficiary includes primary service areas that are outside of the state that are under the GBR as listed as your primary service area. So that's what we're trying to do to make sure that we want every one of your patients in Maryland and in your primary service area to get the same treatment and the same opportunity to change care delivery. So we're hoping that that'll wrap that issue up. There's only a handful of hospitals that have that issue. You have that issue. You have that issue. Garrett has that issue. Allegheny has that issue. That's that's about the that's about the real sum total of where that issue is really. I may have forgotten someone, but that's mostly the scope of who has that problem, and it's we don't want to miss the opportunity to have everybody working because all those patients are under the GBR, and we want them we want all the doctors in the program working together.
And then the formulas contemplated on this sheet, how do we treat Medicare Advantage patients in that? They are in the total, they're not in the total.
This would be for fee for service.
So it excludes, that proposal would exclude then the Medicare Advantage.
Yes.
And then the payment amount threshold in year 3 of 75%, it seems that a lot of beneficiaries. I guess the question is there, in the first round of the Affordable Care Act, patient choice was a really core principle to the CMS authors of the regs, and how do we defend this as not interfering with patient choice if the practitioner, think about it, if the practitioner's got to demonstrate that they have 75% of their Medicare revenue in this programmatic framework, are we going to be required to educate the public and advise them that they're included in this demonstration, or will this be simply invisible to the consumer?
So the view is that we have 100% of Medicare beneficiaries involved in this framework, especially as we move forward with the plan. And we have 100% of Medicare beneficiaries involved in the framework now. So it's 100% of Maryland beneficiaries, 100% of Maryland Medicare beneficiaries. So approximately 745,000 Part A and Part B Medicare beneficiaries, and we have Medicare beneficiaries in Pennsylvania and in West Virginia and in Delaware who are involved in the program through your hospitals already through the global budget. So we already have 100% of Medicare beneficiaries engaged in the program.
I agree with you. We're now extending that involvement to include their relationship with their primary care doctor, and I'm just curious if we see that as a disclosable event with the consumers.
So
because the Affordable Care Act and the ACO formation had pretty in-depth required education and concurrence on the part of the consumer to be considered an ACO beneficiary. That's the reason I'm asking the question.
I think the short answer to your question is it's going to be invisible to the consumer. HCIP, that program doesn't require, as I understand it, the patient sign-up. CCIP does, but they are participating in that particular program. What we're talking about here for purposes of this calculation is just counting all Medicare beneficiaries who are in the state as part of this, MACRA eligibility. So with respect to that question, there's no need to inform them that
so
you
their
are
election to come to that primary care physician puts them in the hospital. Got it.
And the idea is, and it kind of goes back to Adam's question, is it's not tied, this calculation is not tied to the individual beneficiary's participation in the program for that ratio. All it is to say, once you as a clinician have signed on, you've signed the care partner agreement, that makes you an affiliated practitioner. And then the next step is, let's look at your ratio based on all the Maryland beneficiaries for the numerator plus the folks in the PSA who are attached to
is getting the extra folks from the PSC.
If you're a physician and you have 100% of your patients Maryland-based, and you sign on to one of the programs, you're not going to have any. You're going to have theoretically 100%. It's just the physicians, I assume, have a mix of in-state and out-of-state patients that this would be a relevant threshold. Is that my
Right?
understanding?
I think yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Docs under different tax IDs. So we may have several providers under different tax IDs. Does the tax ID play in that somehow or another?
It does, and we might have to get some federal experts in here. But the tax IDs definitely have an impact on how things get worked in terms of the MACRA. I think you have to participate under an NPI plus a TIN. But we can double check if that's correct.
Yeah, I think the issue is that from the regulatory standpoint, it is on an individual clinician level, and so for this exercise, it typically doesn't involve the TIN because one clinician can be in multiple TINs, and the way that our understanding of the regs is and what we've heard is that it really needs to be on an individual clinician. But this is part of the back and forth that we're trying to work on and get clarity as we move forward.
Right, but I don't understand. I'll say that I don't understand the bonus structure, whether it goes on an NPI 10 or just an NPI. So that would be a different result. So I think we could get back and answer that question.
Yes, there's a lot of hospitalists, or not a lot, but there's some moonlighters and part-timers.
Right.
So they may work for another practice, but then they may still shift at a hospital.
Right, and so you could have a primary care physician who is in the CCIP program, who is a moonlighter in the emergency room,
right,
and in the
like
so I think there's some interesting combinations. I don't see that as a problem if they're participating in two programs. It seems great, fantastic.
There might be two different people managing, and that's the real problem.
Mm-hmm.
But quick question, because I want to make sure I understand this separate from the programs in which the physicians and hospitals are engaged, the HCIP and CCIP. In those programs, do the patients have the opportunity to opt out if they don't want to participate in one of those various activities in which the hospital and physicians are engaged?
The patients definitely have the opportunity to opt out on the CCIP program, right, or any care management program. If the patients don't want to participate, they don't have to.
Right. So that's where I was trying to understand how that, for whatever reason, assume a physician has 30% of their patients who opt out. Does that become a problem then? I understand that's the way you're describing it, but do you see CMS raising a concern if a substantial with this MACRA eligibility, if a substantial number of patients opt out of the programs that we're using?
It really has nothing to do with the way the numbers get counted for this calculation. And then let's just give you a corollary. You can have an ACO with attributed patients. And some of those patients might not want to cooperate with the care coordination, but they're still an ACO patient, and the delivery system still has responsibility for them, even though they don't want care management. And so the same thing is true for hospitals. They still have responsibility. So, okay, well then.
Now there's a Medicare Shared Savings Program. Is that what we're talking about? They opt out of information.
So anyway, I think what you were saying earlier is that's not, and the question that you asked was, it's not based on the specific count of the patients in a particular program. It's based on all of the patients in their
right? So getting,
Can I just ask a basic question? The years that you list here for the patient threshold and the payment threshold, those are performance years for the provider to qualify them for the 5% bonus, which would then be paid 2 years later?
That's correct. Okay. Right. So if the VBM applies in 2018 and that makes participation by clinicians in HCIP and CCIP the performance year for 2018, then that 5% bonus would actually go out in 2020. And I just wanted to restate that the concept paper is largely based on the materials that we sent out from the last total cost of care work group meeting, and some changes based on your feedback, emphasizing the hospital financial risk on a statewide total cost of care. And we provide examples of how, in the concept paper, of how revenue risk under the VBM could be structured, and examples of how one could measure hospital-specific total cost of care. And then we also show a sample VBM based on scaling, which we're going to talk about in the next section here, and list a bunch of technical issues that we are going to be talking about here later today that need to be resolved before implementing a value-based modifier. So that's kind of it on the concept paper, unless there are other questions on that. All right, so now I want to turn to an option for scaling the VBM structure, payment structure. The VBM could use a scaling approach like other HSCRC programs, like the MHAC, the Maryland Hospital Acquired Conditions Program. And just want to walk you through this briefly before we turn to the technical questions that we're going to need to be driving toward. But just wanted to highlight the way that this could be structured. Just, for example, each hospital's total cost of care performance relative to its total cost of care benchmark could be transformed from to a 0-1 scale. And so just to give an example on that 0 to 1 scale, 0.5 could be the benchmark. And then the max penalty could occur with a score of 0, with a maximum reward at a score of 1. So here I'm giving an example of two-sided, right, upside and downside. And just for an example, let's say that maximum penalty kicks in if the hospital-specific total cost of care is 3% or more above the benchmark, and the reward is 3% or more below the benchmark. And then to stick with what we had talked about before as an example, that the maximum penalty or reward would be 0.5%, 0.5% of a hospital's Medicare revenue. And then to show this graphically, clicky, there it goes. For those of you whose brains work in pictures or spreadsheets, it's both here. And so showing again with the total cost of care score, and if it's at 0.5, then there is no revenue adjustment. And if the score, as the score goes down, you see that the revenue adjustment goes up to 0.5%, and as the score goes up, it goes up to 0.5%. So that's a high level of a scaling approach. It's really not dissimilar from the kind of concepts we talked about last time, but just putting it into an HSCRC framework.
But looking at the scaling, if we have, groups versus all the way going down, especially with that total cost of care data, because you're almost saying it's so perfect. So when you get into scoring like this, there's a lot of data maybe issues too. And is there a thought to maybe look at another approach, especially in the first phase of the implementation? Because I worry, again, that we're looking at a data set that isn't perfect. And there could be a lot of nuances in it that's going to drive results that is not really what hospitals are doing, but necessary data.
Well, I think we are engaging Mathematica to help us with the scaling approach. So hopefully we can come up with good ideas on how to make that most workable. So I think we don't have an idea stuck in our head exactly of how that would have to be. But it's just a general thought that it's scaling. It starts out it's just like all of the quality programs at the HSCRC, it starts out at a certain level and then it works its way up in terms of the percentage of revenue at risk. And hopefully we'll look at some of our other programs and say, well, we kind of maxed this area out, so maybe we don't need to have as much revenue at risk under some other program that the HSCRC has now, but we need to put more money, because this is an efficiency approach. We need to put more money at risk under this program and maybe less under a different program so that we can place more emphasis on this program and less emphasis on another program, for example, as we look at our whole portfolio of value-based payment programs. So, this is part of the portfolio. It's an important part because it's one that starts to drive performance measures across the system. We're trying to drive them across the system in a streamlined way. And so it starts to elevate in its importance. And so we'll have to see how it fits into the whole portfolio of revenue at risk. Does that make sense, Kathy?
Yeah.
It does make sense.
Yeah, and you weren't planning to get into some of those detailed questions today, because what I was trying to understand is how the benchmark is determined. That's all the work that mathematically will be developing, because even the term performance, I think needs to be defined, as does the benchmark. I'm sitting here just as a quick example thinking that if the benchmark is based on a past year's performance, but then you have a market shift, that market shift could be the cause of a total cost of care success or failure. And how you address that has to be figured out in this methodology.
Right. So that's a great segue to the next section, which is talking about the policy and technical issues that we're going to have to be looking at as we drive forward in the analyses that Mathematica is going to do. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and what I want to do is let her drive through these slides so that it's going to cover a lot of questions. And I think as you see the first two slides, you might think, wait, I got this question, but it might come up in a later one. So what we're going to do is we're going to drive through this section, let her get through the presentation, and then we will rewind, come back up to this point, and then we can walk through each one of them, and this is where the discussion will be.
Before we do that, I'm going to go back a couple of slides. I thought of a question on the HCIP, CCIP, and the calculation of qualification for MACRA. If the physician doesn't meet that qualification threshold for MACRA, does that mean they can't participate in the HCIP and CCIP programs?
They can participate regardless.
Okay.
This is just trying to get additional incentives. So
that was totally about calculating the extra 5%. Basically.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Chris. This is Laura, HSCRC CRISP Health Analyst. And as Chris mentioned, I'm just going to be running through a lot of the questions that you guys actually already started bringing up. And we're just trying to organize them so we kind of have a running list of some of the general questions that we have. So if there's any that, after we go through them all, if there's any that come to your mind also, or other options, please let us know, because we want to make sure we're sort of capturing a lot of those tricky details that we've mentioned. Okay. So the four main sort of buckets of questions are how we're going to measure the hospital-specific Medicare total cost of care. As you mentioned, there's a lot of different things that can affect what that performance actually is. The second one is around the benchmarks and how we measure those. Then the financial responsibility and rewards that are for the hospitals held to, and how, as Donna mentioned, how the VBM interacts with other payment policies that we have, and if there's any adjustments that need to happen based on our whole portfolio. So for the hospital-specific Medicare total cost of care calculation itself, as we've talked through and we're in the concept paper that Chris had sent out for the work group to look at, there were a bunch of different options and methods to use for calculating total cost of care.
And so some of the questions that we try to consider when we're thinking about these methods and that we should all sort of keep in mind are how much hospital spending is appropriately captured. So what we mean by this is that since we want to sort of emphasize to CMS that hospitals in Maryland already have a lot of risk, it's important for our total cost of care measure to have both hospital and non-hospital spending. But then we get to the question of how do we actually attach hospital spending to the hospitals? Is it based on where those costs are incurred, as it currently is in GBR, or are we doing it through a different method, whether it's based on geography or something else? And so some of the questions we have here are how much coverage is actually happening if you do it on a geography-based approach. What if there's Maryland residents who live in a PSA that, or live in a zip code that's not covered by any hospital PSA? There's other questions about if there's a hospital that overlaps, so they share a geography, do you hold each hospital equally accountable for those patients or for those costs and have duplication? Do you split it up somehow, and do you have to adjust if there's different market share or market shifts? And if you have patients who are actually in one area but get the most of their care from a totally different area, which hospitals are you sort of holding accountable for that risk? So those are some of the questions that trying to keep in mind as we think about actually calculating total cost of care. Similarly, we have the non-hospital spending, which isn't, we don't already have a method for sort of attaching it to anyone, so that's sort of an open question. And if there's beneficiaries who don't see a hospital at all, they really have no connection right now in our system. Then we have questions around the denominator and how you, which allows you to deal with market shifts and things like that in growth and population, but it also makes it a little bit more complicated because you have to nail that denominator down as opposed to sort of having sort of an absolute number on top. And as we've mentioned already here today, we're thinking about out-of-state beneficiaries and how does that work and how are we including these in our model, and how do those have to be included in total cost of care? If they do, how do we sort of attribute those or attach those? And then some of the other things is, are there exclusions from this methodology? Some of our standard ones that we use, like burn cases, transplants, and coronary care. CMS kind of wants us to do everything, but based on what we've done in the past, there are some exclusions that kind of make sense that could really sort of change a hospital's numbers. And again, if we have that population issue and we're doing it on that level, we might need to worry about risk adjustment, socioeconomic differences, and things like that that may affect the cost. And as we mentioned earlier, the benchmarks are going to be really important in trying to figure out what we're actually comparing this total cost of care to, and how are we going to compare it? Are we comparing it to sort of the national performance and sort of each year how we're doing, which is kind of how we do the statewide level, or are we going to do it relative to other hospitals or relative to their own, so improvement over time? And the year-over-year issues or cumulative issues compared to base year, these are sort of the different questions that we do differently in our different programs. And then how success is measured based on attainment or improvement and sort of how that works with the scaling. And again, if there's any adjustments needed for some of the issues I said before with population growth or with socioeconomic differences. Then sort of the magnitude of the risk or responsibility under the VBM, and what's the maximum at risk that hospitals would be facing, and are there also the potential for financial bonuses, and sort of how these would be set up, and whether they're revenue neutral or whether there's other conditions, and sort of how those are set up. And then finally, again, as Donna mentioned, we're interested in thinking about how the value-based modifier actually interacts with our other payment policies, knowing that sort of everything in the portfolio that we have affects sort of how the hospitals are doing business and things like that, where we want to keep that in mind and sort of figure out how it fits into what we're already currently doing.
No, we're working on the answers. So we've worn the question mark key off of our keyboard and coming up with this. So let me just rewind to the overarching questions and start there, and make sure that we've got all the questions and other issues that you want to discuss, and we can drive through these slides individually.
Well, I guess one of the questions I have is how Medicare, how CMMI will view this modifier as it relates to the agreement, where we have a requirement to have at least the same amount of revenue at risk for our quality-based programs. If they view this as a quality-based program, which is perhaps another technical question, but there's that requirement in the agreement where we know we're already exceeding what the national programs are doing in terms of the amount of revenue at risk. Is that something that they will set some expectation of as well? Or if and this is, I don't know the answer to this either, if this is a quality-based program like readmissions, MHACs, the other programs, would we be able to adjust the amounts that we already have at risk for those programs? Your last maybe set of questions, the interaction with other policies, so that if we put more revenue at risk for this program, we could have less revenue at risk for those other programs. So I think how CMMI views this is an overarching question here as well.
Well, this is incredibly a quality program, because it's actually linking the physician's quality program with the hospital quality program. So that's like quality the 2 times on steroids. So I think that's it's definitely a quality program, and it's going to be part of our performance suite of quality programs, and it's going to be an efficiency. It's an efficiency and a quality program that is driving toward more outcomes. And so, we expect to see more outcomes measures continually be built into the program. So I think, yes, quality on steroids. And so we have to figure out now how we wrap our quality programs together in a portfolio. Does anybody disagree with that thought process? Stu, do you think it's a quality program? Recognizing that CMS in their value-based purchasing program includes an efficiency adjustment for Medicare cost per beneficiary, and that's part of their quality and value-based portfolio.
Right. I mean, I think it's certainly a value program, and I think that's what quality kind of morphed into the notion of value. I think we need to be careful about how we balance the explicitly existing quality program, so that CMMI doesn't perceive us as reducing the emphasis on that. So that may be an issue, that we have to address. But the question up there, how do you balance the whole portfolio so that you get the right balance between quality, explicit quality, and cost? That's an issue that everybody's dealing with.
Okay. So there's the overarching 4. Now we'll drive through each of them unless somebody has a burning
thought. Who would have ever thought healthcare is this complex?
Nobody.
Seems thematic this week. A couple of observations just for consideration. And, when I was in college, I had to make a decision between majors, and it came down to I couldn't pass math, but I could sort of cheat my way through a foreign language. So I will admit that I'm not a mathematician. But one of the things that strikes me in looking at this is we look at our MSSP data. 41% of the expenses associated with those attributed lives are dollars spent outside of the hospital service area. And I'm struggling a little bit with reconciling that to this idea that we have this perception that hospitals and their markets are nicely contained, measurable units. I think there's a complexity there that affects that. The other is, about the actuarial soundness of this measure for smaller or community hospitals. We might have a total of 35,000 Medicare beneficiaries in our hospital service area. And, I just wonder, when we look at Medicare Advantage and we look at the natural confidence intervals around cost of care related to those proposals, you get pretty nervous with the swings in those numbers. And they can have a wide-ranging swing over a 5-year cycle. So I would concern about that. And then I only have one word to react to your more outcome measures. Yikes. We really have got to examine the outcome measures that we currently measure and report and relate it to this. We just simply cannot continue to build pages and pages and pages of numbers, because if people don't know what's important already, more numbers is just going to make it worse. So we got a lot of measures. Maybe some of them can go away and get replaced, but we really have to start thinking rationally about how many measures of success can we really support, understand, and affect.
To Joe's earlier point, several of our practice locations are right within 4 different hospitals. So when it's time to calculate how well our physicians who are partnering did, how is that going to work? Because if they have patients in 4 different hospitals, how are all these numbers going to come together, their denominator and their numerator? Because it's one calculation, correct, for that time period. Is that right?
I just want to make sure I understand the question. Are you referring to the earlier conversation about how the doctor's own ratio is calculated for macro purposes, or are you talking about how the total cost of care is attributed to an individual hospital, given the fact that physicians are dealing with multiple hospitals?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah.
Because like Joe said, it can, from our perspective, how do we track from our side those patients through, and how do we reconcile what we think our denominator is versus our numerator for each of the hospitals? Separate calculations for each hospital, or is it one calculation for all of our hospital activity? You follow me? As far as the macro goes, what we've been negotiating to avoid the complexity that you're discussing, to have it be at the state level. So you want to go over that again from the doctors? So there's a different thing in terms of how does the HCIP and CCIP program operate. That's a different question, but that's not what you're asking. You're asking the question about macro. So do you want to go over that again?
So you're talking about this ratio?
That's correct. So my basic question is, so let's just use 2018. So at the end of 2018, when it's time to look at each physician's performance in the relationship between each of the hospitals and the physician, is all the data across all their patients for all 4 hospitals in that one formula?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. Again, this is trying to.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think are you asking for a CCIP payout?
No, I'm just trying to understand how our physicians will be used. Will they be used and calculated 4 different times if they have patients in 4 different hospitals, or is it just one?
Yeah, we're trying to make this as simple as possible.
So I understand the problem, and the discussion we've had. So let's just use an example. There's 4 hospitals, and they have 20% of their patients at each hospital, and the other 20% are somewhere else. So when you hit a 50% threshold, if you attach that to each entity, then they would never be able to meet the macro threshold because they'd only have 20% in, even though they had 20% at A and 20% at B and 20% at C and 20% at D. So what we were negotiating to make things easier for all of us is to use the state as the territory as opposed to each hospital's program. Otherwise, we might come up with something where we had such a complex calculation and we wouldn't allow our doctors to be easily successful by working with all of their partners. And so we want you to be focused on how to get care redesign done, hopefully, and we're working hard to try to work on the other end of this equation.
So I think this may be the helpful one to look at, and that is, let's say that you have a clinician who's working in 4 different hospitals and only one of them has a program, CCIP, let's say, that they sign up with. Well, the hospital is an advanced APM entity, so that's a check. And the clinician has partnered through HCIP or CCIP, even if it's just one of those hospitals, doesn't matter. That's a check. That physician is now an affiliated practitioner. And then the next step is, okay, what is the threshold for the ratio? And then when it gets to the ratio, doesn't matter which hospital, whether or not that hospital participates in the program, whether or not that individual physician is seeing patients who are in that program through that hospital. When we get to this point, this is all trying to be very basic, trying to be as encompassing as possible. So it's just, who are all your Medicare enrollees, and then the numerator is the Maryland ones plus those in a PSA.
And in the end, we're trying to make it simple. If it turned out to be a problem and people weren't really participating, but they were playing small games to get large groups of doctors in but not actually participate, then CMS says to us, well, we're going to look at what you do, and if we don't like it, we'll make more rules so that they don't qualify anymore. So we really want to make it as administratively simple as possible, and we want everyone participating. That's what the state wants.
I guess I'm trying to decide whether this question goes back to an additional overarching question or falls under a number of those overarching questions, and that has to do with any time we develop a policy, those policies, particularly ones that have penalties and rewards, quite often not only have unintended consequences that we may not think of ahead of time, but also have to be taken within the context of the overall revenue flow that's going to individual hospitals on an annual basis through our update process, through our GBR process. And so I guess the question I'm raising is simply, when does the policy itself result in an underinvestment, potentially cause an underinvestment in the programs we need to be successful in order to move this model forward? That we take through a penalty or the combination across all programs, potential penalties, so that an individual hospital does not have sufficient revenue to invest in these programs.
Can we take that up in the payment models work group or the performance measures work group? Because I think that's where that question belongs, is the adequacy of the payment.
Well,
it's really not.
But I'm reading here, how do we set benchmarks for assessing performance, and how much in financial?
We're going to have to take the philosophical question of when is enough revenue enough into the payment models work group and not this, so we won't get through the technical things we need to do here, I think.
Well, and we at least agree that that is critical to the success of the design of this program.
It's certainly an item worthy of debate.
Question. So as it relates to measuring total cost of care, at some point, and I remember this from the update factor paper that the HSCRC put out, it did say that hospitals would be held accountable for measuring total cost of care and hospital specific, but it's sort of I've heard potentially the update factor could be at some point scaled based upon your performance. And my question is there other methodologies such as that this would play into, or is this specifically, this is going to be that measurement, and there won't be this plus potentially saying, and we're going to put your update factor at risk? That's my question. You understand what I'm saying?
How many times do you get hit for total cost of care?
Yeah. Could there be other, because you said it could quality and efficiency. So from an efficiency measure, you could be measured on efficiency for even a full rate application, for example. I know I'm not asking you to answer that question, but are there other implications? So you would like to have that question answered more fully in this process of how it relates to other policies that would relate to updates? Yes, because I think to Mike's point, I guess understanding the overarching use of this and the attribution and the benchmarking, I think it would be helpful to understand that as we try to make those decisions. Okay.
So I don't know whether this fits in here or not, going back to the broader questions of issues related to, and it may fall as a subset under the first one, do you think about total cost of care not as a single measure to take into account some of the points that have been raised here? There may be a geographic overlap issue. There may be something broader than that. Is there only one calculation that is used, or can we do a mixture? I would assume that could be considered under one. And in terms of the benchmarks, we could also be thinking about asymmetrical. I mean, the line that we saw before was linear, but you could think of asymmetrical approaches, particularly in the earlier years associated with it. I mean, the requirement is on the federal government side is that you have to have more than a nominal amount of risk, but you could still have more than a nominal amount of risk on the downside, and still, because of the impact that you have on hospital spending already at 55% and 100% risk on that, perhaps has something less on the downside. At least put that up on the list of questions to ask. I will say that I do tend to like the idea more of creating overlapping sets of responsibilities among hospitals. I don't want to see battles over individual patients. I want to see us figure out ways in populations and geographic areas to cooperate, because a patient that shows up at one hospital one day is a patient who shows up somewhere else the next, and if we can encourage cooperation, I would much rather see that. That's just my general bias at the get-go.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, there's some trade-off issues, because there's some hospitals that have a fairly small primary area, and so, we've been talking about the balance between episodes and geography, and we need to power into that technical part of the analysis here. My personal favorite, which hasn't been vetted, is to have half of it based on geography, where we have complete overlap happen, because there's no way that we can operate in a world of lack of cooperation on a patient-centered approach. And the other half may be on episodes. That could take some of the inability to the technicality possibility of market shift adjustment out of the equation, because you could make half of the modifier based on one of them and half of it based on the other one. That doesn't mean that that's the right answer, but that's kind of a favorite in my head in terms of how you could be more comprehensive in the total cost of care in a geography and not be parsing out A, B, C, D, and E. That's just another way to think of it, and so it also helps to foster cooperation at the local level, which we really need if we're going to work with primary care physicians, and if we're going to work with the group that is working at 4 hospitals, and it's just fostering that collaboration around the patient. So I think there's some alternatives, and once we start powering into the data to look at, that could be something that we don't have on the table yet. That as we get deeper and deeper in the data, that we could do a 50-50.
Well, I want to think about, the point that Joe raised earlier about 40% of the cost being outside of his service area. Some of those patients may be coming down for specialized care in Baltimore. I'd want to be able to encourage the type of care coordination and cooperation between the hospital that is providing that care, if they're referred down for that specialized care, and repatriating them back rather than. So I guess open to the idea of not a single calculation, but multiple ways of looking at it is all really what I was trying to get at, and that is not off the table yet, not knowing exactly what that would be.
Right. No, I think it's not off the table, and it appears to me that we've drafted the amendment agreement to allow that.
Put some of that data together so you can see it. Is a lot of those spends outside of the service area are Florida, South Carolina. I'm not completely sure. It's been beautiful weather all winter this year, but somehow it thins out dramatically in the county in the winter months. No, it really is fascinating when you begin to look at where they get health care and how much of it is not in the purview of any of the management schemes that we've experimented with or are considering because of that migratory nature of this population particularly. So I'll send you some of that. It's interesting stuff.
It does show up in the data that we publish for your service area too. It says the out-of-state folks are listed. Out-of-state providers are shown separately there.
Just one thing for consideration, I don't know if it's embedded in here or not, but might be to look at maybe for whether there's any progression beyond Part A and Part B costs, if that's to be considered. I don't know if that's already been looked at for Medicare costs, for total cost of care. So that's one thing. The other thing, which is again sort of something to be looked at for progression, which is, are we only talking about Medicare, total cost of care, which I assume we are, but if there's thoughts that at some point that would go beyond Medicare, that should be thought about too.
All right, so those are some of the overarching questions. So let's Donna, you wanted to say something else?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's drive through some of the specifics to make sure that we've covered the issues, and the discussion here has been great. So these are a lot of things that we need to continue to think about as we look through the data, things to keep in mind, what the trade-offs are. So on a hospital-specific Medicare total cost of care, capturing hospital spend, overlapping geographies, we've had some discussion about that already. Non-hospital spend. So I think we've hit a lot of these things. Just want to be sure in case somebody else has some some thoughts, and anybody on the phone who wants to weigh in either on this. Kristen?
I just have a technical question, I think. So the data that we are supposed to be getting when we sign these agreements, I believe includes any patient that's touched our hospital within the last 3 years. So, I guess I'm concerned that if we include the patients who have not touched the hospital in this measure, we're kind of flying blind with those because we won't see the patients in our kind of service area that haven't been using hospital services in the last 3 years. So I just wanted to bring that up as a technical issue.
Yeah, I think they're in the limited data set, and we would be looking to try to drive more granularity into the limited data set without patient identifiers on it, but with provider identifiers so that you can see which providers are doing what types of services. But the identifiable patient data doesn't come without the relationship.
Right. So I guess, as a non-clinician, what I see as a challenge is as those patients who are not currently using hospital services start to kind of move into that higher risk, if our providers that we're working with could manage those patients. I mean, hospital costs are a large cost, so if we can manage those preemptively, that might be helpful. I think that's one of the goals of the Maryland model.
So if when that comes and the data comes for that, then there really shouldn't be too many patients who don't touch a hospital or a primary care doctor. Then the N of patients gets smaller and smaller, and most of them are not very ill.
So until we get to a point where we have, I guess, the majority of that non-hospital spending data at the patient level, are we proposing that would be in the total cost of care measure or outside of it?
It's in the contract, so it's already in the contract. It's in the total cost of care measure now, so it's in.
I get that. So I can see how I'm doing, but I can't necessarily have the physician manage that patient in a certain way because I don't know who they are.
I mean, I think what you'll end up finding, to be honest with you, that you won't really end up with a lot of patient management issues in there. It'll be more provider management issues as opposed to patient management issues. That things that start to pop up there that may have procedures that are not necessary, and so then you'll be thinking about having working with the radiology in the community-based setting to come up with some avoidable utilization programs or with radiologists. And so I don't think it's going to be, if you get somebody who's never hit a hospital in 3 years, once they hit the hospital, then their data flows, but I don't think they're going to be in the screaming risk category if they haven't been to a hospital in 3 years. But I may be wrong about that, but I think what you'll end up needing to address are provider issues of other types.
My second technical question is just, if the hospital is being established as the advanced alternative model or payment model and signing up for the HCIP and CCIP programs, which allows us to get that detailed patient level detail. And maybe this is too technical for this group, and we can follow up afterwards. But what can we then share with our physicians?
You have to follow HIPAA the same way you do with an ACO, and that's really you'll find your counsel who works with you on your ACO data sharing will be very helpful in your data sharing on the HCIP and CCIP program.
Chris, I'm trying to work this backwards from a pretty tight timeline for November of 17. Do you have thoughts around, since there's only two fundamental variables, attribution of patients and attributions of dollars, you're going to propose 1, 2, or 3 models that we could react to, and then based upon that, seeing the data so that we have an idea of what this looks like running past into calendar year 18. Because I think at the end of this, the attribution is never going to be perfect. We understand that. I think everybody accepts that, whether your patients or the dollars. But I do think people are going to want to see maybe 2 or 3 models that would be proposed that we could react to that would have data that would allow us to make reasonable sense out of this. And I think having enough lead time is going to be really helpful because this is a pretty tight timeline. And so I think it would be helpful for us to work it backwards from when the submission needs to go in, and then thinking about not 1 model that we could react to, but at least 2 or 3 models that would make sense.
Yeah, that has been my thinking. And so that's part of our process. We will walk out of here and figure out exactly what the timeline is going to be and what the analytics are, and bring multiple things for you to react to based on the data.
And we would be able to see that data as well, because I think that's going to be important for us to help inform all of us as to what we think models make most sense for all of us collectively.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. So that's the slide on the hospital-specific Medicare total cost of care. So I'm going to flip to the next one. I don't know if somebody wants to add anything or things for consideration with respect to the exclusions and adjustments.
Yeah, I think I raised one earlier. I think how you handle a market shift adjustment or market shift from the benchmark year or the base year to the performance year is something we'd have to make an adjustment for here. We won't necessarily see that in a risk adjustment.
Yep.
Any policy decisions to see like market share, but I was wondering rate order, unit rate development. I mean, that's pretty technical, but how that impacts the total cost of care.
I would just add to that, it's actually potentially any type of rate adjustment and change in, if a hospital closes, shifts programs from one hospital to another, which should show up as market shifts, but also what if there's a rate increase for capital, for example. So as we're looking at, I think it goes hand in hand with what Mike and Kathy are saying. There's these rate issues that we just need to understand and consider.
Yeah, and of course, the overriding one, which I know we're looking at now for 16 year end, is compliance, where you could look good or not so good depending on how you adjust rates for compliance either at a calendar year or a fiscal year end, which could flow through the measurement. It depends on what the measurement year is for the performance under the benchmark.
One other potential exclusion, and we see this in the MSSP program, the end-stage renal disease patients sometimes are carved out of the utilization calculations. There's probably a lot of philosophical reasons for that. The reality is that population is really resistant to any kind of interventions that might modify utilization. I know, of course, there's a whole ACO program just for them, but it's something to look at because it's already there in CMS's policy.
So one additional adjustment I'm thinking of. So year-over-year changes in quality incentives, obviously, is going to play a role in how total cost of care changes if you're measuring at an individual hospital level. And then this may piggyback on what Mike's talking about with market share, but obviously changes in PAU levels year over year is going to be something that we need to look at in terms of total cost of care. Because obviously hospitals are held harmless for those increases and decreases in PAU levels in their revenue base. So that will have some level of interaction with hospital total cost of care, I believe.
I will make one comment. comment on, I mean, because these are all complex rate issues, and you could get pretty wound up calculating the interaction of them, and they are important. But Medicare, when it does its ACO benchmark, doesn't take any of those things into account. And maybe that's bad, or maybe that's good, and maybe they work out over time, but they don't take any of it into account. And I just want you to, we are going to have to get out the gate, and we're going to have to not let the perfect get in the way of the good. So we have to get something good out of the gate and refine it. But I will just make that comment that Medicare doesn't do any of those things. We can do more in Maryland because we're up close and personal with the hospital industry, but we won't be able to make adjustments for everything, or we'll be up to 2021 before we get done the calculations. But I do want to just recognize that Medicare doesn't make adjustments for rate differences. It was actually, to me, it was actually eye-opening because we had some huge rate adjustments going on in the country over the last 3 years for DISH, and the ACO benchmarks were not adjusted for all those DISH adjustments. So it's pretty, in some ways, our adjustments are not as significant because we pool things. So, like the uncompensated care, and they had all these things going like this, and they didn't adjust the ACO benchmark. So anyway, just a little side note there. They won't adjust the benchmark if it goes back up. That'll be fairly ugly for those participating ACOs. Yeah.
I would ask for us again to look at socio-demographic risk stratification. CMS is looking at it closely again for all the right reasons. There's more and more data in Medicare populations and MA populations. The data is pretty compelling. It's hard to argue with good quality data. I think we should look at it very, very closely.
I absolutely agree, and I think the issue here is not so much in comparison in aggregate terms, but largely we're going to be looking at changes over time. And so the question there is how impactful are the shifts that may occur in those geographies or whatever episodes, whatever the people involved, and does that change as much over time? I would imagine that it's probably less of an impact than it is in comparing one area to another. But to your point, if it does change, that does change the underlying cost, I suspect.
Well, certainly also over time we'll have people wanting to have more of the benchmark based on attainment and not just improvement. And so as we get attainment into the mix, then we need to be certain to think about socio-demographic issues.
Well, that's a good segue to the next one is setting benchmarks for assessing total cost of care performance. Again, keeping in mind we're talking about this for a year one purpose. But once the method is set for attaching total cost of care, how should the benchmark performance be set? What's the comparison group? The methodology, and then once the benchmark is set, how is success measured and what adjustments are needed? We've already heard a lot of discussion on these points and things that we're going to have to come back to you with multiple options for consideration. In case there are any other thoughts on this particular point.
You might want to look at trauma and see how it would impact this calculation.
Can you say more on that?
You don't have any control over hospitals don't have any control over whether they have trauma patients come to their facility or not, and so holding them accountable for trauma patients as part of this is, it's hard for them to be held accountable for the trauma patients.
Which somewhat goes back to the exclusions that was listed before.
another, and I don't know again whether it's here, but the question was raised earlier when we do this modifier, this adjustment and scaling, whether that's going to be scaling all payer revenue or just Medicare. I mean, the benchmark is, it could be just a Medicare benchmark or all payer, but I'm wondering whether when you talk about comparison groups, whether that varies in any way because you look at something on an all payer basis versus a Medicare only basis. So it may just be just a question mark for now, how answering that question, how we're going to do this affects the benchmark, if at all.
Right. And so one of the things that, as we've talked about, for example, being a 0.5% max on the Medicare spend, you can calculate that. Okay, so what's the equivalent on the total on an all payer basis, and how does that vary across hospitals? That's what I think is what you're getting at, and looking at some of that. And I think that's something that will be part of the analysis to see as we look at the differential benchmarks across hospitals. When you translate some maximum Medicare amount, right, as we look at, okay, what's the worst case scenario on a Medicare standpoint, what does that translate to in an all-payer basis? And that'll be part of the analysis.
Yeah, I guess what I was really getting at there is that if you do it just the way you described it, where you apply a performance on Medicare to an all-payer number, it's making the assumption that how you performed on Medicare is how you performed on all patients. And that is at least how I perceive it when you apply the Medicare performance to all payer revenue.
So I just want to be clear. I wasn't meaning that it would actually be on an all-payer basis for year one. It is only on Medicare. I'm just saying one can, if you're trying to look at the impact of how much that amount is, let's say it's 0.5% on a Medicare basis, what does that translate to an all-payer basis to give an overall bigger picture? But in terms of how this is structured, I see it as just on the Medicare side of things.
Right, but ultimately it sounds like we're using the modifier and scaling that you showed an example of to adjust all payer revenues, because that's how we adjust revenues in our system.
No, I think the question is, so it's an open question, but I think the question is, do we take, let's say it's a whole percent on Medicare for the moment. Let's round up to a whole percent. And let's say you have a negative adjustment of 1% on your Medicare. So if a third of your revenue is Medicare, does that translate back to 1/3 of a percent adjustment, or are we leaving it at 1 on an all-payer basis? And so I think we've been talking about in easing it in to go in a more conservative mode, but there are those two options. Should we go easing it in on the Medicare revenue, and obviously you have to implement that on an all-payer basis. But just like the inpatient revenue at risk, when we calculate the inpatient adjustments and we spread it over all payer, the percentage of all payer revenue gets reduced. The same thing could be applied in the Medicare situation as we introduce it. So it could be a larger number, and when it gets spread across, it becomes a smaller number. So that's the question we need to answer in the technical. We haven't dug in to say, we're going to assume that all payers are operating exactly the same, because we don't actually believe that.
But I hear your point, which is about that you're pushing this a rate change potentially if it's done on an all-payer basis, and assuming that those effects are somewhat the same. So
we weren't going into this assuming that they were exactly the same. In fact, I think we actually have evidence that they're not exactly the same, right? We have like a 2% spread historically between how things are happening on Medicare versus non-Medicare. So right now we have evidence to the contrary, at least as it relates to the hospital cost. So we are trying to ease into this as quickly as we can so that we can ramp up on our progression plan. But that does doesn't mean that we have to make assumptions about what happens in Medicaid or commercial happening at exactly the same rate as Medicare.
Question. So I think these are the right questions. I'm wondering, will you have Mathematica actually be running some data? So for example, I definitely have seen a lot of volatility in total cost of care year over year. Concerned about that and wondering if we were able to look at some of the history when we're trying to decide what's the timing methodology. Is it year over year, cumulative? I think it would be helpful to look at some modeling around that type of information.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's how we can test for how strong a measure might be. Is if there's a lot of volatility, what are the impacts of that, and what do we need to think about in terms of the trade-off? Absolutely.
And I think that also that is really volatility is what drove the progression plan discussion in the direction of using a value-based approach as opposed to saying, okay, we have to divide up all the consumers in Maryland and put them into an ACO, and everybody has to take downside risk of trying to get over the hurdles of that volatility. So this is kind of an ease in by putting limits on gains and losses as we all kind of learn about the volatility and how to control total cost of care. So I think the big N of 745,000 beneficiaries in Maryland, that's a big N, and so that reduces the volatility on a statewide basis, so that we can have the value-based approach. And still the theory that we're testing really is by having a value-based approach at a hospital level and at a provider level, as we loop in our primary care physicians and our hospitalists and our emergency room doctors, that if we can manage that at a more local level by having the big N at the statewide level to take into account extreme volatility, that we'll be able to manage that better than the rest of the country. So that's the kind of the theory that we did with phase 1 with the hospital model, and that we're trying to continue into phase 2, if that makes any sense.
And it's a great point. And to the extent that we see volatility, hospital-specific measure, trying to figure out why that exists, and is it a market shift issue? What's going on? And using that to inform the discussion going forward.
And just to put it in context, if you have your ACO if you had a 10% negative volatility in an ACO and you had a downside risk, you would have a 10%. If you have 10% downside risk, you'd have 10% hit. With a value-based modifier, you're probably going to get a 0.5% hit, but it's going to be better than a 10% hit. So because we're trying to manage the volatility as we get into this increased understanding of total cost of care, and spreading the volatility over the state instead of concentrating it in a single provider. That's what we're trying to do. If that makes any sense.
I do think one point, though, that is we will have to think about as we go through this. Mitigating that risk is of value, but you also want to be able to show the people you are partnering with that their actions will result in can actually result in activities that result in savings. And so if it becomes too disassociated with what you're doing, people get dispirited. I mean, I've done all the things I'm supposed to do, and yet I'm still getting dinged. Those are not words I like to hear. You would rather have it so that if people are in and all in, that there's a way of measuring that. So I think it is a bit of a balance of how one does that. And again, we're different than ACOs elsewhere around the country. We have 55% of Medicare Part A and B already on downside, 100% downside risk. So compared to any other ACO in the country, we're under a lot, individual hospitals, hospitals individually and the state collectively is under a hell of a lot more risk than any ACO is in the country.
I just have one, it's a comment more than an addition to a question, but just being mindful of when we get into, even looking at when we looked at the waiver in the past with national data, is getting rid of some of the noise, is that we spend so much time trying to dig into data sets and looking at data and what's wrong with the data, is that from a benchmarking perspective, keep it as simplistic as possible so that we're trying to move what we can control. When it becomes out of our control, we spend so much time. And that national data set is so large. That's just it.
My only comment on the benchmarking is I really kind of just wondering out loud, does this diversity of the hospitals in the state lend itself to a singular benchmark, or are there some, or could we or should we consider categorically, are there benchmarks that apply to sole community hospitals that are different than a benchmarking for academic medical centers, just to use the two extremes? I'm not advocating, I just wonder out loud, does one shoe really fit all on total cost of care?
Well, that's something I know the federal government has been looking at in their ACO benchmarking, and hopefully our consultants will be able to dig into that knowledge base.
I don't want to go too far afield because all of these different measurements we use, we look at year-over-year changes in performance. But one of the concepts that we built in, at least on the hospital savings part of our current agreement, is looking at things on a cumulative basis. And I'm wondering whether we should be setting in this or any other program we have a multi-year goal or a long-term goal. We want to get to X% reduction in total cost of care or some performance benchmark, and so that as we look at one of these various options here, we can be looking at an approach where maybe in year one, an individual organization doesn't make much progress in terms of a year-over-year performance, but they're beginning to put in place a series of activities that on a multi-year basis will end up at the same endpoint as someone who had those programs in place on day one and gets a greater reward and someone else getting a penalty, even though we're all working to what might be the same end goal. I'm not trying not to overcomplicate this because this is already so complex, but I just am suggesting that because we have this other concept about looking at hospital savings on a cumulative basis in the model already, that we begin to think about some of these programs on that same basis as well.
I think that's interesting. Actually, one thing that I kind of like about the Care First Medical Home program is it looks at the persistence of performance, so that it looks at year one and year two and year three to see, and if you're doing better, or it looks at the multiple years performance and deciding how to calculate your award. So there may be some ways to consider the cumulative or persistence. There are the ups and downs of that issue. So if you get in the hole and you can never get out, it's kind of discouraging. But then if you do great and you don't want to, so there's some policy issues there to work through.
And it's complexity as well, because we were talking about, the idea of increased risk over time, which we'll get in the next slide as a possibility. And so theoretically, that was one of the reasons, so you don't have to necessarily have small benchmarks that rise. You can hold that, address it on this side, and so then are you trying to address it on both the benchmark side as well as the revenue at risk, and is that more complexity than it's worth?
Yeah. But I think improvement from a base is certainly the goal that we've set forward in the model.
And so now the question, the easy one, I think, right, is how much responsibility and reward for total cost of care performance under VBM, recognizing we're just talking about for a year one issue. And we've talked about some of this. Well, I guess, should hospitals also have the potential for financial bonuses, and if so, should they be symmetrical? John has already mentioned this. Should they be revenue neutral on a statewide basis, and should there be other conditions for receiving those bonuses? So any additional thoughts that folks want to weigh in on?
And I think I raised this at the last meeting. Theoretically, we could have a situation where individual hospital or hospitals meet or exceed their benchmark and get rewards, but on a statewide basis, we fail the total cost of care metric. Or look like we're going to fail, and as a result, the commission takes action. The question is to avoid a total cost of care failure. So the question is, should we put in some kind of requirement that the statewide total cost of care metric is on track in order for those rewards or penalties to be awarded? Don't know. Again, I'm just raising it here, but there's an interaction between the two, I think.
Yep. I'm wondering, this is sort of tangential, and we brought this up earlier, but the interaction between this and the other quality programs. So could a hospital be doing well on total cost of care, but be doing poorly on a variety of the value-based quality programs, and be jeopardizing quality monitoring and population health measurement for the state? And is that something we should be thinking about?
And both of those are really around the next piece, which is the interaction with other payment policies. But just want to be sure if there are any other thoughts on this one, Donna.
So the question might be, if you have a decline in your quality scores, but you beat the quality indicator, should you be allowed to have? I mean, the cost indicator, should you be restricted from getting the cost award? Is the question. So I'm not putting an answer out there, but just the question.
All right. And so going to, I think this is the last slide. So how does the VBM interact with other HSCRC payment policies or broader issues? And we've had some discussion on this already, but just want to give full time for any other issues.
Yeah, and I think it may have also been similar to the last one. And this concept of temporary adjustments for various policies like the quality-based versus permanent revenue adjustments. So I guess the question here is this going to be viewed like QBR and MHAC and readmissions, where every year we reverse out the prior year's adjustment and then come back in with a new scaling for the next year? Or is this going to be a permanent revenue adjustment to a hospital's base?
And so that might hinge partly on whether we use a cumulative versus an annual approach. So those conversations should be tied together. If it's annual, it probably gets baked in. If it's cumulative, you could reverse it out and put it back in, for example. I mean, those are the kinds of discussions we could go through.
And does anyone on the phone want to jump in on anything? All right. And
one last thing. This may have already been said, but I do think we need to look at, again, at what is at risk, revenue at risk in totality across all of our adjustments, including when you think about our what is now the newest, the CAU savings adjustment. But so there, I think we have to really look at everything and say, wow, how much revenue do hospitals have at risk, and look at what we're trying to accomplish. And so I would ask that we consider that.
John, did you have a comment?
No, I just think these are great questions. I'm worried a little bit about the timing of coming up with the answers. Given the points that were raised earlier, the need to be able to model and understand the implications. You can think of something in theory, but you also need to be able to figure it out. And I'm not sure yet whether staff in your own mind have thought about what a timeline might look like here for the completion of answers to these questions. How quickly do we need to progress on this?
Yeah, that's what we're going to be doing here shortly. Laying that out in more specificity. We know what the end goal is, and then it's like filling in the pieces. So maybe I've been in somewhat denial, but I'll be moving to the acceptance stage here shortly.
So I do think making sure that we build into it the opportunity for folks to be able to model it, to digest it, look at a variety of different approaches is going to help socialize that going forward. And I think, again, in our discussions with our friends at CMS, to be able to say, look, we're proposing this now. We'll try this, but heck, if it doesn't, if for whatever reason this doesn't work, we may need to change it, and we shouldn't be handcuffed to a particular approach if, as we're experimenting here, as we're demonstrating here, something is materially doesn't work.
I mean, I think the way that things have been drafted in the amendment are open enough to allow for free weighting or using a combination of episodes and geographies, and that. And we have an annual approach to adjust the benchmarking methodology. Mm-hmm. So I think that we've tried to keep the flexibility in there to allow us to evolve as we have historically in Maryland, and that's what we're focusing on continuing forward, is to keep the ability to improve.
My interest is, would that apply to the magnitude of the amount? So if we've been saying 0.5, is there some range around that 0.5 that CMS will be willing to accept? Are we locked into a number in the amendment, or does the HSCRC have flexibility on that, on upside and downside of that number?
I mean, I would expect going forward in the future that it would increase over time, similar to other value-based programs. So that we would start at a modest level and increase over time. And the rate of increase might depend on how things are coming along in the system, similar to what happened with readmission. It accelerated because at the beginning we weren't making the progress we needed, but so I think the speed of change would be relational to other factors that we don't know yet, and we'll have to see how that would pan out. But there's no specific level there, but we have to go in with a credible level. If we don't have a credible program, then it won't. We have to make sure that we go in with a credible program so that we can be working in partnership with our physicians to get something that will satisfy the our colleagues at CMS that we're serious about partnering with physicians and clinicians, and so that's what we need to make sure. And also, we need to make sure that we're demonstrating that we really are taking on the phase 2 progression in a meaningful way. There are other things going on in the state too, in terms of ACOs and other activities that are going on that are also taking on the same issues, and those will all play into how evolution occurs.
On the issue of flexibility, I just want to remind people that flexibility doesn't just entail doing something and then changing that thing, but also implementing up front the things that can be done up front and identifying priorities for looking at stuff over time to incorporate new features into. So this is a great set of questions. We don't have to answer every single one of those questions before November or January. We do want to take them into consideration and prioritize so that we answer the most important ones to get a program that's workable and acceptable to everybody. But stuff can be added over time as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, with that, let's wrap it up. And our next meeting, to help me get over my denial, is March 29th. So that's it, same time, same location. And thank you very much. It's been very helpful.